I have filed 406 reports in my career. I wrote the first one when I was young enough to still believe that fear was something that happened to other people, to lesser analysts, to beings who hadn't yet learned to see the shape of a threat before it fully arrived. I do not believe that anymore. I have not believed it for some time. This is the 407th. My name is Ordrin Vesk. I hold the rank of Senior Threat Assessor within the Concord Assembly's Exterior Intelligence Directorate, a title that sounds more impressive in formal correspondence than it feels most days, sitting in a cramped analysis suite 3 decks below the Assembly's central spire, drinking cold calf and staring at sensor logs until my eyes ache. I have assessed 41 species in 26 years of service. I have written the reports that convinced the Assembly to open trade routes, close trade routes, arm border stations, and once, memorably and not happily, recommend full quarantine of an entire star cluster after what we found there. I am telling you this so you understand that when I say I did not sleep for 6 days after what I am about to describe, that is not hyperbole. That is a professional admission, made under my own name, entered into the permanent record. It started with a request for reclassification, not from me. From the Threshold Compact, the loose, uneasy alliance of species that share a border with the Ashveil Dominion, a power so old and so quietly terrifying that most Concord citizens have never heard its name, because we have spent 3 centuries making very sure they never had a reason to say it aloud. The Ashveil do not conquer. They do not need to. They simply exist at the edge of known space the way a sheer cliff exists at the edge of a hiking trail. You do not fight a cliff, you route around it, and you teach your children never to walk too close to the edge. 40 years ago, a species new to interstellar travel drifted by accident, close enough to that cliff to draw the Ashveil's attention. That species called itself human. I want to walk you through this the way I walked through it myself, because the order in which I learned things matters. It is the only way to understand why my hands were not steady when I wrote this. The first flag came from a relay buoy on the outer skirt of what the Assembly formally calls the Ashveil Reservation, and what everyone else calls the Quiet, a 30 light-year sphere of space that the Ashveil claim by right of first presence, and enforced by a method so effective that no species has challenged it in living memory. Ships that enter the Quiet without invitation do not return. This is not folklore. This is documented, catalogued, and taught in every Concord Academy as the first lesson any cadet learns about the wider galaxy. There are places you do not go, and the Quiet is the oldest and most absolute of them. The buoy logged an anomaly at 0219 station time. A vessel, registry unknown, had entered the outer skirt of the Quiet at low velocity, on a heading that suggested deliberate approach rather than drift or navigational error. That alone would have been enough to trigger a priority flag. What triggered a director-level alert 40 minutes later was the vessel's response when an Ashveil interdiction cruiser, one of the silent hunting shapes that patrol the boundary, moved to intercept. It didn't run. I need you to sit with that for a moment the way I had to sit with it, because everything else in this report depends on you understanding how wrong that is. Every species that has ever brushed the edge of Ashveil space has done exactly one thing when confronted. It has fled, as fast and as far as its engines allowed, and it has counted itself fortunate to have the chance. This is not cowardice. It is the single most rational response available to any thinking creature that values its own continuation. I have reviewed 41 species military doctrines. Every single one of them, without exception, includes some version of the principle, know when the fight is not survivable, and do not have it. The unidentified vessel held position. It matched the cruiser's approach vector, decelerated to a stop at a range of roughly 800 kilometers, and did something our sensors initially misread as a targeting error. It opened a communications channel. Not a distress call, not a surrender beacon, a conversation. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell every week. First contact, ancient empires, and the slow, dawning horror of an alien intelligence realizing they've underestimated us. If that's your kind of story, the subscribe button is right below this video, and hitting it means you won't miss the next one. There's also a like button, and I promise it takes less time to press than it took you to read this sentence. All right, back to Ordrin Vesk, 3 decks below the assembly spire, about to have a very bad week. The translation matrix took 11 minutes to resolve the language. It came back with a designator I had seen exactly twice before in my career, both times in low-priority cultural files that had been sitting untouched since before I was assigned to this desk. Human, Terran Standard English. I pulled the file. It was thin. Humans had been spacefaring for approximately 43 years, a blink of an eye by any galactic standard. Our surveillance had logged them expanding cautiously into their local stellar neighborhood, establishing a handful of colonies, engaging in trade with 3 minor species along their border, and generally behaving in exactly the manner our threat models predicted for a young, resource-limited, technologically unremarkable civilization. The classification on file read Category Delta, Emerging, Non-Priority. Nobody had updated it in 6 years. Nobody had needed to. The transcript of the communication once the matrix finished its work read like this. Human vessel. Unidentified cruiser. This is the independent trading vessel, Whistling Kestrel. We're aware we've crossed into a restricted boundary. That wasn't intentional. We picked up a distress ping on an old frequency and came to check it out. We're not looking for trouble. If you want to talk, we're listening. There was no response from the Ashveil cruiser. There never is. The interdiction protocol does not include dialogue. It includes exactly one action, executed with the calm, absolute efficiency of a species that has not needed to improvise in 300 years. The Kestrel's crew, and here is the detail that stopped every conversation in the analysis wing when it circulated, did not run. They waited. 40 seconds after the silence confirmed the cruiser's intentions, a second voice came over the channel. Lower, calmer, addressed not to the Ashveil but to someone aboard the human ship. The Matrix rendered it as, all right. Let's not make this a habit, but let's not make it boring either. Then the engagement began. I have watched the recording of that engagement 11 times. I am not being dramatic when I say that each viewing has unsettled me more than the last, because each time I watch it with a slightly different question in mind, and each time the footage answers a question I did not know I needed to ask. The Ashveil cruiser was not a minor vessel. It was a standard interdiction-class hunter, the same design that has ended every prior incursion into the quiet, within a window of 11 to 19 seconds. Its weapons profile, drawn from decades of long-range sensor analysis, categorizes it as capable of disabling a vessel 3 times the mass of the Whistling Kestrel before that vessel's own targeting systems could complete a single firing solution. This is not conjecture. This is measured, verified, cross-referenced by 4 separate conquered intelligence services who have spent collective centuries trying to understand exactly how dangerous the thing patrolling that boundary actually is. The Kestrel took the opening exchange and lost roughly a third of its forward shielding in under 2 seconds. By every engagement model in our database, that is the moment the encounter should have ended, either in the Kestrel's destruction or, in the vanishingly unlikely event of survival, its immediate and total retreat. It did neither. What it did instead, and I want to be careful with my language here, because I have rewritten this paragraph 9 times trying to find words that are accurate rather than merely dramatic, was adapt in real time, in a manner that no engagement model in the Concord's possession accounts for. The Kestrel's pilot began flying a pattern that our own tactical analysts, reviewing the footage afterward, described as aggressively non-optimal, meaning, in plain terms, that it made no sense according to any doctrine we have ever catalogued, from any of the 41 species we have studied. It should not have worked. It worked. The cruiser's response timing, a machine of habit built on 3 centuries of engagements that always went the same way, began to lag. Not by much, fractions of a second, but the Ashveil do not have fractions of a second to spare, because their entire method depends on a target behaving the way every target has always behaved. The Kestrel was not behaving that way. It was behaving like something that had never been told what it was supposed to do when facing an unbeatable enemy, and had therefore never learned that it was unbeatable in the first place. 4 minutes and 31 seconds after the engagement began, the Ashveil cruiser disengaged. I want you to understand what those words mean, because I did not understand them myself the first time I read the sensor log. Ashveil interdiction cruisers do not disengage. in 300 years of recorded incursions, and the Concorde has recorded every single one, because understanding the Ashveil's method is the closest thing our intelligence community has to a religious obligation. There is no precedent for an Ashveil vessel breaking off an engagement it initiated. Not one, not ever. It happened here. The cruiser withdrew toward the interior of the Quiet at a velocity our sensors flagged, almost apologetically, as consistent with tactical repositioning rather than retreat, which is the kind of hedge an analyst writes when the truth is too strange to commit to without a second opinion. I did not need the hedge. I had watched the footage. That was not repositioning. That was the first documented instance, in the entire history of the Concorde's contact with the Ashveil Dominion, of one of their vessels choosing to stop. The whistling kestrel damaged, its forward shielding still bleeding energy into vacuum, held position for another 90 seconds. Then it turned, unhurried, our sensors noted, at a pace that suggested nothing resembling panic, and departed the Quiet along the same heading it had entered. I sat in my office for a long time after reviewing that footage. I did not write anything for almost 2 hours. I simply sat, turning the implications over, feeling the shape of a fact that did not fit into any category I had built across 26 years of assessing threats. Then I did what I always do. I opened a blank document and I started asking better questions. Here is a confession that will not appear in my official report, because it is not the kind of thing a senior threat assessor is supposed to admit. I had barely thought about humans before that week. They were a Category Delta file. Non-priority. The kind of species you check on once a year, note the absence of anything alarming, and move on to the 40 other files that actually demand your attention. That changed within 6 hours of the Kestrel incident. I requested an emergency data pull from every source available to the Directorate. Trade logs, diplomatic correspondence from the 3 minor species bordering human space, historical archives the humans themselves had made publicly accessible through their early, remarkably open communications networks, and every scrap of surveillance footage our long-range assets had gathered over 4 decades of quiet observation. What I found, over the following 72 hours, is the reason I have not slept properly since. I began as I always begin, with military history. Every civilization reveals itself most honestly in how it fights, because warfare strips away the polite fictions a species tells about itself and shows you what it reaches for when everything else has been stripped away. I have done this 41 times. I know the pattern. Early conflict is brutal, personal, resource-driven. Middle period conflict grows more sophisticated, but remains recognizably tied to the same motives, dressed in newer ideology. Then, if the species survives its own escalating capacity for destruction, comes the turn. Horror at what they have built, followed by a slow, uneven movement toward cooperation and restraint. Every species I have studied follows this arc more or less. It is close enough to universal law that deviations from it are, by definition, the most important thing an assessor can find. Humans deviated from it, severely. Their early conflicts were exactly what I expected. Brutal, personal, small in scale, driven by scarcity and territory in ways that would be unremarkable in any species ancient. History. I flagged it, noted the expected pattern, and moved forward through their timeline expecting the arc to continue as it always does. It did not continue. It accelerated. Where other species warfare becomes less brutal as civilization matures, a natural consequence of growing moral complexity outpacing the tools of destruction, human warfare became more efficient at a rate that outpaced every other measurable aspect of their development. I want to be precise about the distinction, because it is the single most important finding in this entire report. Less brutal means a civilization is developing resistance to the act of violence itself. More efficient means a civilization is getting better at violence, refining it, studying it, treating it as a discipline worthy of the same rigor they apply to medicine, to agriculture, to the construction of bridges. They have an entire academic field devoted to it. They call it, without irony, military science. I read for 3 days without stopping except to sleep, and even then poorly. I found a period in their history, roughly a century before their first crewed spaceflight, where two dominant human powers each developed weapons capable of ending not merely a war but their entire species, every living thing on their homeworld, in the span of a single afternoon. I have seen this kind of weapon appear in the historical record of other species before. It always appears once. It is always used at least once in a spasm of violence so catastrophic that it either ends the species outright or so thoroughly horrifies the survivors that the weapon is never built again. Humans built thousands of them, and then, having built enough destructive capacity to erase themselves several times over, they did not use them. For decades, two powers capable of ending the world sat within striking distance of each other, weapons armed and ready, and neither side fired. I asked a junior analyst on my team, a sharp young thrall named Ipsa Corvain, barely 4 years into her posting, to explain this to me in her own words, because I wanted to hear how a mind less worn down by 26 years of this work would process it. She thought about it for a long moment. They wanted to make sure the other side could never feel safe enough to be the one who fires first, she said. Does that comfort you? I asked. No, she said. I don't think comfort is the right word for it. It is not. I have found, buried in their declassified historical archives, individual accounts of humans who held the survival of their entire species in their hands during that period. Men and women staring at instruments that told them, with every indicator screaming confirmation, that an attack was already inbound, protocol demanding immediate retaliatory launch, and who chose, against every instruction and every institutional pressure, to wait, to question the data, to be wrong about following orders rather than risk being right about ending the world. They were right, every time I could find a record of it. The instruments were malfunctioning. The species survived because individual humans, alone, under catastrophic pressure, with incomplete information and every rational argument pointing toward immediate action, chose patience instead. I have thought about those individuals more than I expected to. I still do. The section of the human archive that ended my ability to sleep normally was not about their wars. It was about who they chose to fight them. Every spacefaring species maintains some form of elite military tier, specialized forces selected for the situations ordinary military structures cannot handle. This is not unusual. The Concord has such forces. The Ashveil, we assume, have something similar, though the concept feels almost redundant applied to a power that is never needed to try hard at anything. What varies between species is the selection criteria, the specific quality a civilization decides is worth cultivating above all others, when building the individuals it will send into its worst possible days. Most species select for capability, raw physical performance, tactical intelligence, technical proficiency. Find your most capable individuals, give them superior training and equipment, and deploy them where ordinary forces cannot go. It is logical. It is efficient. It is exactly what I expected to find when I opened the human file on their special operations forces. It is not what I found. Human elite selection programs, and they maintain several, distributed across different national and regional structures on their homeworld, each independently arriving at strikingly similar conclusions, are not primarily built to identify the strongest, the smartest, or the most technically skilled candidates. Physical and cognitive standards are extreme, by any measure I can apply, but they are not the selection criterion. They are the entry price. What they are actually testing for is what happens after a candidate has been pushed past every threshold they believe themselves to have. The training doctrine, translated as faithfully as our matrix allows, describes a deliberate, systematic process of removing any visible endpoint from extreme physical and psychological stress. Sleep deprivation stretched across days rather than hours. Physical exertion continued not until exhaustion, but through exhaustion, into a state their own literature describes with a phrase that stopped me cold the first time I read it. The point where your body has already quit and you're moving anyway. The candidates are never told how long the trial will last. They are never shown a finish line. This is not incidental cruelty. It is the entire design. A species that measures endurance against a known limit produces individuals who are excellent at enduring known limits. Humans deliberately built a selection process with no visible limit at all, because what they wanted to find was not the individual who could endure the most. Every candidate is, by that late stage, suffering equally, but the individual who kept moving without knowing when it would stop. Their own training doctrine states the principle almost casually, as though it were self-evident rather than one of the strangest things I have encountered in 26 years of this work. The ones who make it through are not the ones who feel the least pain. They're in exactly as much pain as the ones who don't. They just keep going anyway. I sat with that sentence for a very long time. I have studied 41 species. I have never encountered another civilization that deliberately, systematically, as a matter of formal institutional policy, selected its most dangerous individuals by removing hope of an endpoint and observing who continued to function regardless. Every other species I know builds its elite forces around confidence, the belief that they can win, that the mission is achievable, that the odds, however difficult, are odds a skilled operator can beat. Humans appear to have built theirs around something else entirely, not confidence that they will succeed, a decision made in advance that they will continue regardless of whether success seems possible. I do not have a category for that. I looked. I do not have one. I would like to tell you that the Kestrel incident was an isolated anomaly, a single strange encounter that the Concorde could study at leisure from a safe analytical distance without further pressure. That is not what happened. It is never what happens in my experience. The universe does not grant an intelligence officer the luxury of finishing one crisis before the next one begins. 9 days after the Kestrel's engagement, the Ashveil took a station. Not destroyed it, took it. A joint research and monitoring outpost, Carvelis Reach, staffed primarily by Threll and Ondu personnel, with a small human liaison team present under a recently signed and, in retrospect, catastrophically premature trade agreement. 308 beings engaged in the unremarkable business of a scientific installation became, within the span of perhaps 30 minutes, hostages. In the particular manner, the Ashveil have refined across 3 centuries of never once needing to explain themselves. No overt violence, no visible weapon discharge that our long-range sensors could detect. Simply an installation, surrounded, outmatched, and made unmistakably, silently aware of both facts. The message that followed was addressed not to the humans but to the conquered. And through the conquered, to every species watching the border, with the particular quality of attention that had settled over the entire assembly since the Kestrel's return. It was short. My translation matrix rendered it without a single ambiguity, which is itself unusual for Ashveil communications, which typically favor a formality bordering on the ornate. You permitted this species proximity to our boundary. Their conduct is now your responsibility to correct. They meant the humans. They meant that the era of quiet, uncontested authority over that boundary had been disturbed for the first time in living memory, and that 308 lives were the price the Concorde would pay for having allowed it to happen at all. The assembly convened an emergency session. I was summoned to attend, an irregular request, since assessors of my rank are ordinarily consulted from outside the chamber, not seated within it, but Director Halvorn looked at me across the briefing table, with an expression I had not seen him wear in the 11 years I had served under him, and said simply, "You're the only one who has actually read everything, Vesk. Sit down." I sat down. The session that followed lasted just under 5 hours and arrived, as these sessions almost always do when the Ashveil are involved, at the only consensus the assembly ever reaches in situations like this: negotiate, concede whatever can be conceded, and resolve the matter before the Ashveil's patience, a resource everyone in that room understood to be both finite and terrifyingly narrow, expired entirely. The human diplomatic representative arrived at the negotiation station at 14:20 station time. No one had invited her. No one, notably, tried to stop her either, which I noted at the time and understood far better afterward. Her name was Ambassador Renata Calder. She was not young. She walked into the chamber the way a being walks into a room it has entered 100 times before and never once been turned away from, presented credentials that the station's liaison staff processed with visible confusion, and took a seat at the table without waiting to be asked. Chairman Ovessa Threll, a diplomat of considerable seniority who has, in my observation, survived 4 decades of interspecies negotiation without once losing his composure in open session, looked at her with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating in real time. "Ambassador," he said, "we were not aware humanity had been invited to this session." "We weren't," she said. "We came anyway." A pause. "We are in the process of formulating a negotiated response to the Ashveil's demands regarding Carvelis Reach." "Don't," she said. The chamber went quiet in a way I have rarely heard it go quiet. "Don't what precisely?" Chairman Threll asked. "Negotiate," she said. "Not this one." She reached for the carafe of water at the center of the table. Water, which is not, in my experience, what most beings reach for in a room this tense, and poured herself a measure with hands that did not shake. "Give us a little time. We'll handle it." Admiral Corin Vale, commanding the Concord's 3rd Border Fleet and a being who does not, as a professional habit, display visible emotion in formal sessions, asked the question every reasonable being in that chamber was thinking. "How large a deployment are you preparing, Ambassador?" Ambassador Calder looked at him with an expression I can only describe, in the careful language of a threat assessor trying to remain precise, as mild. "4," she said. The Admiral blinked. 4 vessels. 4 people. I have sat in a great many rooms where difficult information was delivered. I have learned across 26 years to read a chamber the way I read a sensor log, quickly, accurately, without letting my own reaction distort the data. What happened in that room when Ambassador Calder said 4 people was not panic. It was not confusion exactly either. It was the specific, disoriented stillness of an entire assembly of very experienced beings having their working model of reality quietly, calmly, moved several degrees without their permission. 4 personnel, Director Halvern repeated slowly, from beside me, against a fortified Ashveil, holding with 308 lives at stake. Yes. You understand the garrison strength the Ashveil typically maintain at a secured installation. You understand their— "I understand it," she said, and for the first time something in her voice sharpened. Not with anger, but with the particular weariness of someone who has answered this question, or one very much like it, more times than she can comfortably count. "I'm not being reckless, Director. I know exactly what I'm sending. That's precisely why I'm not worried about the number." She would not elaborate further, no matter how the session pressed her. She answered questions about logistics, about the communication protocols already quietly established with Carvelis Reach's remaining staff to ensure the hostages understood help was already in motion, about timing and extraction and the diplomatic language that would be used once the situation resolved. On the single question of what 4 human operators actually intended to do inside a hardened Ashveil installation, she gave nothing at all. At 1650 station time, she excused herself, suggested the assembly break for a meal, and departed with the calm, unhurried gait of someone who fully expected the situation to still be manageable when she returned. I did not eat. I went back to my office and opened, for the 4th time that week, the Human Special Operations file. At 1737 station time, Carvelis Reach went dark, not destroyed. Our long-range sensors would have registered any weapon's discharge of sufficient scale to disable an installation that size, and they registered nothing. The station simply stopped transmitting. Every automated beacon, every routine telemetry pulse, every low-level system chatter that a functioning installation produces as a matter of course. Silent, all at once, as though someone had reached out and turned the volume down on an entire structure floating in vacuum. I found Ambassador Calder roughly 30 minutes later, in a small observation lounge near the station's primary docking ring, sitting in a chair slightly too large for her, a cup of something warm steaming faintly in her hands. She was watching the dark shape of Carvelis Reach through the viewport with an expression of complete, unhurried patience that I have thought about many times since. "How long?" I asked her, because I did not know what else to ask. She glanced at me. "Not long," she said. "Less than an hour." "How can you be certain?" She considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. "Because I know who I sent," she said, and offered nothing further. We sat in silence for a while. I did not press her. I have found, in 26 years of this work, that some silences carry more information than any answer would, and I did not want to disturb whatever she was carrying in hers. At 1822 station time, 52 minutes after the station went dark, slightly longer than her estimate, a discrepancy I noted in my report without comment, because I have decided it is a piece of not knowing I can live with. Carvelis Reach came back online. Systems restored. Life support nominal. All 308 personnel accounted for, unharmed, gathered in the station's central common area where someone had, at some point during the preceding hour, directed them to wait and where they had evidently waited. The Ashveil garrison, 42 soldiers according to our best sensor estimates going into the incident, was alive. Every one of them. Secured, disarmed, systems access severed, but alive and, per the medical sweep conducted once Concord personnel were permitted access, physically uninjured. Our own tactical modeling team, running the numbers afterward in an attempt to reconstruct what had actually occurred, produced a statistical probability for that specific outcome so improbable that two separate analysts flagged their own results as calculation errors and had to be corrected by a third. It was not an error. It had simply happened. Quick pause before we get to the part that made me want to make this video in the first place. If a story like this is your thing, subscribing genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it's free. Hit the like button too if you're enjoying this one so far. Okay? Back to the station. The Ashveil garrison commander, a senior officer within their command structure, a being our files describe as having displayed, across every prior recorded interaction, an emotional register best characterized as absent, opened a channel to the assembly chamber shortly after the station systems came back online. Every available member had reconvened to receive it. His expression, rendered through our translation and imaging systems with as much fidelity as the equipment allows, was one I had genuinely never seen an Ashveil wear in any footage I had reviewed across my entire career. It was the look of a being who has just had the foundational assumptions of 3 centuries, quietly, calmly relocated several degrees to the left, and has not yet decided what to do about it. The humans, he said, sent a message. Chairman Threll asked, carefully, "What message, Commander?" The Ashveil officer looked away from the pickup for a moment, as though consulting something off-frame, then returned his attention to the chamber. They said, "We were being polite. Please don't make us stop." The chamber was silent for a very long time. I have watched the extraction team's exterior helmet recordings, released to Concord Intelligence under a limited access agreement negotiated in the weeks following the incident, more times than I am comfortable admitting in a formal report. I will describe what I observed as precisely as I can, because precision is the only thing I have to offer that the footage itself does not already show more eloquently than my words ever could. 4 humans entered a hardened Ashveil installation, garrisoned by 42 soldiers of a species that has not lost an engagement in 300 years of recorded history. They did not use overwhelming force. Sensor telemetry recovered from the station's internal systems afterward showed weapons discharge levels consistent with, at most, brief, isolated exchanges rather than sustained combat, which our analysts initially assumed indicated the humans had simply avoided detection entirely. They had not avoided detection. The Ashveil garrison's own internal logs recovered during the Concord's limited post-incident review showed the moment their systems first flagged the intrusion, and the astonishing brevity of the interval between that detection and the moment their entire chain of command ceased functioning as an organized force. What the footage shows, watched closely, is not brute efficiency. It is something closer to what I documented in the human archive during my research into their historical warfare, individual operators making individual decisions in real time, each one different from what came before, each one exploiting some specific gap in the Ashveil's response that no engagement model, ours or theirs, had ever accounted for. Because no engagement model is built to account for an opponent who does not appear to be operating from any fixed doctrine at all, I asked Ipsa Corvain, who reviewed the footage independently and produced her own analysis before we compared notes, how she would describe what she saw. She thought about it for a long time before answering. "They fight like the fight is already over," she said, "and they're just finishing the paperwork." I have not found better language than that, and I have tried. At no point in the recovered footage does any human operator appear to hesitate, panic, or deviate from what I can only describe as a state of complete, working calm. Even in the 2 instances where telemetry indicates an operator sustained injury, significant enough that by any standard I have applied to any other species, should have ended their capacity to continue. In one recorded instance, an operator's suit integrity was compromised sufficiently that emergency SEAL protocols engaged automatically. The operator's own biometric readout, recovered afterward, showed a heart rate elevated but stable and continued forward movement within 4 seconds of the SEAL completing. I want to stay with that detail because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in this entire report. A being, injured, in a hostile installation, alone in the specific way that combat makes every participant alone regardless of how many teammates surround them, chose, in the span of 4 seconds, not retreat, not hesitation, but continuation. 4 seconds is not enough time to decide anything. It is enough time to have already decided, long before that moment arrived, and simply be executing a decision made somewhere else. At some earlier point, possibly years earlier, in a selection process specifically designed to produce exactly this outcome. The 4 extraction team members exited Carvelis Reach 41 minutes after entry. Docking footage recovered from the station's exterior monitoring array shows them returning to their shuttle at an unhurried walk. Several visibly favoring injuries that our medical staff later confirmed included 2 fractures and 1 moderate energy weapon burn, none of which appeared to affect their pace in any way our analysts could measure. One of them said something to the others as they walked. The recording caught the sound, but at that range, could not resolve the words clearly enough for our translation matrix to render with confidence. Whatever was said, it made the other 3 laugh. I have not needed to know what they said. I needed to know how they looked saying it, which was, like people who had expected, the entire time to walk back out. Director Halvorn found me in the corridor outside the analysis wing 3 days after Carvelis Reach was fully released back to Concord administration. He has looked at me many ways across 11 years of service together, critically, approvingly, with the particular impatience of a superior running short on time. He was looking at me that day in a way I recognized only because I had been feeling something very much like it myself for over 2 weeks. "Final report," he said. "Timeline?" "End of the week," I told him. He studied me for a moment longer than the question required. "What's your actual assessment, Vesk?" "Not the official language." "What do you think?" I turned over in my hand a small object I had been carrying since a member of the human liaison staff, a young man named Foster, who had been among the hostages at Carvelis Reach and who I had interviewed extensively during the post-incident review, had pressed it into my palm almost as an afterthought, the way one hands over something they no longer feel the need to hold on to quite so tightly. It was a coin, small, heavier than its size suggested, made of a metal alloy denser than anything in common Concord use, worn smooth along its edges by what must have been years of handling by many different hands before it reached mine. "I think," I said, "that we made a very old mistake. We looked at what they had built in 40 years of spacefaring, and we decided that told us what they were. We should have looked instead at what they had already survived for tens of thousands of years, before they ever left their own atmosphere." He held my gaze for a moment. "And what did they survive?" he asked. "Before that?" "Themselves," I said. "Mostly. For a very long time." He nodded once, said nothing further, and continued down the corridor. I went back to my office. I filed the official report, the version with section headings and censor appendices and formal reclassification recommendations, the version that will sit in the permanent Concord intelligence record for whatever analyst comes looking for context on this period a decade or a century from now. I believe it is accurate. I believe it will be useful. I do not believe it captures the whole shape of what I actually learned, because official reports rarely do, and this one least of all, so I opened a second document. No classification headers, no formal recipient. Something written as honestly as I know how to write anything, for whoever eventually needs to understand what we found. Every species I have ever studied goes to war ultimately for survival. That is the engine underneath all of it. However, the specific justification is dressed up in a given era's language, territory, resources, ideology, security. Even the Ashveil, beneath 3 centuries of unchallenged dominance, are doing what every living thing does at the most fundamental level, protecting what belongs to them, ensuring their own continuation. Humans do this too. I do not want to overstate the difference, because the difference is not that they lack a survival instinct. Every account I have found suggests it burns in them at least as fiercely as in any other species I have catalogued. The difference is a layer beneath that instinct, one I searched for a matching pattern in 40 other species files and did not find. They go to war sometimes, for people they will never personally meet, for outcomes they will not live to see, for principles that cannot be weighed, measured, or converted into any resource a threat assessor's models are built to track. They send their own people into situations both the sender and the sent understand, with total clarity, to be likely lethal, not because the alternative is worse for the individuals doing the sending, but because they have collectively decided that something exists which matters more than the people being risked to protect it. And the people who go, the ones who pass through selection processes designed specifically to find them, appear, from everything I have read, to agree with that calculation. They examined the terms in advance. They said yes anyway. Humans have a word for the internal structure that makes this possible. Several words, in fact, across their many languages, but the one that recurs most often in the material I reviewed is duty, not obligation, which implies pressure applied from outside, but something built inward, over time, that requires no external enforcement, because the person carrying it is already enforcing it upon themselves. 4 people went into a hardened installation held by a species that has not lost an engagement in 3 centuries. 4 people came out. 308 hostages came out. 42 Ashveil soldiers came out. No one I have spoken with since, not one official across 2 assembly sessions and countless corridor conversations, has thought to ask what those 4 operators looked like on their way back to the shuttle. I have watched that footage more times than I will admit in a formal document. They looked like people for whom the mission had been hard, but never once in doubt. Like people who had looked directly at something that should, by every rational measure available to any of the 41 species I have studied, have been impossible, made a note of it, and moved on to whatever came next. The coin is on my desk as I write this. I turn it over more often than I probably need to. There is an inscription on one face, worn but legible, which I had translated in the early days of this investigation, and then set aside for weeks, because at that point I was still building toward understanding it and was not, I think, emotionally ready for the specifics. I am ready now. It reads, "The only easy day was yesterday." I have sat with that phrase longer than any single sentence I have encountered in 26 years of this profession. It is not a boast. I want to be completely clear about that, because my first instinct, trained, I suspect, by decades of reading propaganda from species who very much do want you to believe they are unbeatable, was to read it as one. It is not claiming superiority. It is not celebrating strength for its own sake. It is a description of a chosen reality, stated plainly without embellishment, by people who built their entire selection process around the willingness to accept it. The hard thing is always coming. Tomorrow will always be harder than today. There is no finish line visible, and there never will be, and they have made their peace with that fact so completely that it appears carved onto objects they carry into combat, worn smooth by the hands of everyone who carried it before. And they keep walking toward it anyway. I do not know who will pull this file next, whether it will be a conquered officer decades from now, trying to understand the early period of human assembly contact, or someone from a species not yet known to us, encountering this record through channels I cannot presently imagine. I do not know what the balance of power in this region of the galaxy will look like by the time you read it, or what choices will have been made, by us or by them, in the years between my writing this and your reading it. Here's what I know, and what I want you to take seriously. Whatever policy framework the Concord eventually builds around this species, whatever careful diplomatic language gets used to describe what happened at Carvelis Reach, in the versions of this history that circulate publicly, they sent 4 people into a fortified Ashveil installation. 308 lives came out unharmed. 42 members of a species that has not lost a fight in 3 centuries came out unharmed as well, because the 4 people who went in decided, deliberately as a matter of restraint rather than incapacity, the hardest possible thing to fake under combat conditions, that mercy was still available to them even in the middle of a fight they could have simply won by other, more permanent means. We were being polite. Please don't make us stop. I have turned that message over as many times as I have turned over the coin. It reads on its surface like a warning, and it is one, and it should be understood as one, by anyone reading this who has any influence over how the Assembly conducts itself with this species going forward. But underneath the warning, I have come to believe, is something closer to an offer. A demonstration of exactly how much worse this could have gone, delivered specifically so that no one would ever need to find out by experience. That is not the behavior of a species that wants conflict. It is the behavior of a species that has spent its entire violent, extraordinary history learning precisely how much force is necessary, refining that judgment down to a precision most of us cannot fully appreciate because we have never needed to develop it ourselves, and choosing, in the moment that mattered most, to use exactly enough and not one measure more. I have requested reassignment. I have explained my reasoning to Director Halvern in a separate private communication, but I will say here what I have not said officially. I have spent 26 years learning to see threats clearly, and I am no longer certain I can see this particular subject with the professional distance the role requires. There is too much of it sitting in my chest, in a shape I cannot yet categorize, and I do not trust myself to write objectively about a species I have started, against every professional instinct I have cultivated across my entire career, to genuinely admire. The Assembly has not yet responded to my reclassification recommendation. I suspect they are doing exactly what I did in the early days of this investigation, searching for the right category, discovering repeatedly that the category does not yet exist, and sitting with that absence in offices that have grown noticeably quieter since the Kestrel first refused to run. I kept the coin. I do not know what the galaxy will look like in 50 years, or what choices will be made about this species, or by them in the decades of contact that are almost certainly still ahead of all of us. I know this much, and I am placing it here, in permanent record, so that whoever reads this next cannot say they were not told. 4 people walked into a fortified installation held by the most feared power in known space. 41 minutes later, everyone inside was alive. Take that seriously. Whatever policy this becomes, whatever measured diplomatic framework eventually gets built around it, do not fail to take that seriously. They were being polite. We should all hope very sincerely that they remain so. I have filed 407 intelligence reports in my career. This is the only one I was afraid to send. I sent it anyway. Ordrin Vesk, Senior Threat Assessor, Concord Assembly Exterior Intelligence Directorate. I did not get my reassignment. I want that noted honestly because I said at the time that I intended to request it, and I did, and Director Halvorn read my request. And then he did the thing superior officers do when they have decided your discomfort is less important than your usefulness. He promoted me instead, gave me a slightly larger office 2 decks up, and told me the human liaison desk needed someone who already understood what he called, without a trace of irony, the shape of the problem. I did not want the shape of the problem. I got it anyway. This is, I am told, how most careers in intelligence work actually progress. Not by choice, but by the slow accumulation of things you cannot unknow, until you are the only person left in the building qualified to sit in the room when the next difficult question arrives. The difficult questions did not stop arriving. 6 months after Carvelis Reach, the Assembly finally convened a formal session to determine humanity's permanent classification within conquered threat and diplomatic frameworks. A session I attended not as an outside consultant this time, but as the desk's ranking officer seated at the table rather than summoned to it. Ambassador Calder attended as well, considerably less unannounced than her first appearance, having spent the intervening months establishing what has since become the Concord's first formal, mutually negotiated liaison agreement with human authorities. I watched the debate unfold across nearly 6 hours, and I want to record briefly what struck me most about it, not because it belongs in the official record, but because I think it says something true about how a species like ours processes a discovery like this one. Half the chamber wanted humans classified as a priority threat, subject to the kind of cautious arm's-length monitoring the Concord reserves for powers we do not yet trust and cannot yet predict. The other half wanted them classified as a priority ally, fast-tracked toward the kind of deep cooperative agreements that might eventually place human forces alongside conquered ones along contested borders, including, unspoken but understood by everyone in that room, the border nearest the quiet. Both sides were, in my professional judgment, correct. That is the part I have not stopped thinking about since. It is rare in 26, now 27 years of this work, to encounter a case where the caution and the welcome are equally well-founded, where every argument for fear is matched, point for point, by an equally strong argument for hope, and where the honest answer to what should we do about this is simply, carefully, and with more humility than we are used to bringing to any other species we have ever assessed. I said as much when Chairman Threll finally turned to me and asked directly what the desk recommended. I recommend, I told the chamber, that we stop trying to decide whether humans are a threat or an asset, because I do not believe that is the correct question. The correct question is whether we are prepared to be the kind of neighbor that deserves the restraint they have already shown us twice, unprompted, at no obligation to themselves. I do not know if we are. I think that is worth finding out before we decide anything else. The Assembly did not reach full consensus that day. They rarely do on questions this large. But they did vote, by a wide margin, to formally reclassify humanity out of Category Delta entirely, into a designation that did not previously exist in Concord records created specifically for this session, Category Unresolved, Priority Engagement. It is, as far as I am aware, still the only entry of its kind in the entire intelligence archive. I still carry the coin. Foster, the young liaison officer who gave it to me, and who has since been reassigned to the new Joint Concord-Terran Border Office, a posting he apparently requested personally, messaged me not long ago, mostly to ask, with what I have come to recognize as characteristically human directness, whether I'd ever actually figured out what to write in the box on my forms marked threat designation. I told him the truth. I told him I had left it blank because I still had not found the honest word, and because I'd come to believe, after everything, that inventing one prematurely would be its own kind of dishonesty. He said that was probably the right call. He said humans didn't always know what to call themselves either some days, and that maybe that was less a gap in either of our understanding, and more just an accurate description of what it's like to be a young, uncertain, occasionally terrifying species still working out what it wants to become. I have thought about that message more than I expected to. I think on balance he may be right. The coin sits on my desk as I close this file. The only easy day was yesterday. I do not know what tomorrow or next year or the next century of contact between our two civilizations will actually bring. I know that whatever it is, I would rather face it having taken this species seriously from the beginning than having made, twice, the mistake so many of my predecessors made with so many others, mistaking quiet for weakness, restraint for absence, and politeness for something less than exactly what it was. They were being polite. I intend to keep remembering why that mattered. Ordrin Vesk, Director, Concord Terran Liaison Office. If you enjoyed this one, there's more like it. New HFY stories every week. Subscribing costs nothing and helps this channel keep making them. See you in the next one.